The reconnaissance aircraft circled at 18,000 feet, its cameras clicking in methodical rhythm over the American anchorage at Ulithi Atoll. The photographs, when developed aboard a Japanese cruiser 300 miles away, showed what the intelligence officer had feared and expected in equal measure. 17 aircraft carriers, their flight decks gleaming in the tropical sun, crowded the lagoon like steel islands. The officer dutifully recorded the count in his logbook, cross-referenced the silhouettes against identification manuals, and forwarded his assessment to Naval Intelligence Headquarters in Tokyo. What he could not know, what no amount of training could have revealed to him, was that he had just counted 8 carriers that did not exist. The photographs were real, the ships were real, but somewhere between the camera's shutter and the analyst's conclusion, reality had quietly split in two. By November 1944, Japanese naval intelligence maintained with absolute confidence that the United States Navy operated between 30 and 35 aircraft carriers in the Pacific Theater. Officers in windowless rooms in Tokyo tracked these vessels on enormous wall maps, moving wooden markers across painted oceans as reconnaissance reports filtered in from distant waters. The commanders planning Japan's defense, the pilots being trained for suicide missions, the submariners hunting American task forces, all operated from the same foundational understanding of their enemy's strength. They were fighting an armada of unprecedented scale, a fleet that suggested American industrial capacity had achieved something close to the miraculous. The truth, discovered only after Japan's surrender when Allied intelligence officers walked into those same rooms and examined those same reports, was that America possessed exactly 22 operational carriers. 13 ships existed only in Japanese assessment documents, in the minds of intelligence analysts, in the strategic calculations that guided Japan's most desperate decisions. These phantom vessels, as insubstantial as morning fog, would prove more destructive than many real ones. The illusion began with photographs that told partial truths. Aerial reconnaissance pilots flying at extreme altitude over American anchorages captured images distorted by distance, weather, and angle. An escort carrier photographed from directly above, its proportions compressed by perspective, became indistinguishable from a fleet carrier in the developed print. A Long Island-class escort vessel, barely a third the displacement of an Essex-class fleet carrier, appeared identical when reduced to a grainy black and white silhouette on reconnaissance film. Weather complicated everything. Cloud cover forced reconnaissance aircraft higher, reducing detail. Ocean glare washed out shadows that might have revealed true ship dimensions. The cameras themselves, vibrating in unpressurized aircraft at extreme altitude, produced images that required interpretation rather than simple observation. And interpretation, as Japanese intelligence would demonstrate with devastating consistency, was where certainty dissolved into multiplication. The double counting began innocuously, the inevitable result of a military bureaucracy under impossible strain. Japanese naval intelligence operated without a centralized database for tracking American vessel movements. Reports from submarine commanders in the Central Pacific reached different analysts than reconnaissance data from the Solomons or radio intercepts processed by cryptographic units. When the same carrier appeared in multiple reports from different sectors over several weeks, separate officers recorded separate sightings without coordination or cross-reference. No master list existed to reconcile these accounts, to plot movement patterns that would reveal a single ship moving rather than multiple ships occupying different locations. The system rewarded reporting and counted thoroughness by volume of intelligence gathered rather than accuracy of analysis. Each report was filed, each sighting was logged, and the carrier count climbed steadily upward throughout 1,944, untethered from the physical reality it was meant to measure. The USS Enterprise became the perfect symbol of this multiplication. Japanese intelligence recorded her sinking on 4 separate occasions between 1,942 and 1,944. Each time, reconnaissance confirmed hits. Damage reports from radio intercepts suggested catastrophic casualties, and analysts concluded with relief that America's most famous carrier had finally been eliminated. And then, weeks or months later, reconnaissance aircraft would photograph Enterprise steaming with a task force, her flight deck crowded with aircraft, her distinctive profile unmistakable. Rather than recognize the obvious conclusion that earlier damage assessments had been wrong, Japanese analysts arrived at a different explanation entirely. America, they reasoned, must have built multiple Enterprise-class carriers. The original vessel designation system must have been abandoned in favor of name replication. The ship that kept appearing couldn't possibly be the same one they had already sunk. The industrial capacity required to replace fleet carriers as quickly as Japan was reportedly destroying them suggested an American manufacturing capability that bordered on the supernatural, but this conclusion felt more plausible than admitting their damage assessments were systematically inflated. The count grew not because America was building faster, but because Japanese analysts couldn't accept that they were sinking slower than reported. Allied psychological operations understood this vulnerability and exploited it with surgical precision, though not in the way post-war mythology sometimes suggests. American intelligence didn't fabricate phantom carriers from nothing, didn't create elaborate false radio networks, or construct wooden ship silhouettes in empty anchorages. The deception was subtler and therefore more effective. Radio operators transmitted using call signs for carrier divisions that included real and theoretical vessels intermixed, knowing Japanese codebreakers would catalog every designation as evidence of a distinct ship. Communications protocols referenced fleet compositions using numerical designations that implied larger forces than actually existed. Decoy operations launched from existing carriers employed radio traffic patterns suggesting multiple task forces operating in coordination, when in fact a single carrier group was simply changing position. The genius of the approach was that it required Japanese intelligence to make the final leap toward wrong conclusions. Americans provided ambiguous information. Japanese analysts, already predisposed to believe in overwhelming enemy strength, interpreted that ambiguity in the direction their fears pointed. The phantom carriers materialized not through American creation but through Japanese perception. Confirmation bias infected the assessment process at every level, transforming intelligence gathering into a mirror that reflected what Japanese commanders already believed. High Command wanted to believe in unlimited American industrial capacity because such belief justified their increasingly pessimistic strategic assessments and excused their mounting losses. If America could produce carriers faster than Japan could sink them, then defeat became inevitable, and current setbacks became merely symptoms of an impossible situation rather than evidence of strategic failure. Junior intelligence officers learned quickly that reports suggesting fewer American carriers than previously estimated were received with skepticism and suspicion, while reports confirming or exceeding previous counts were accepted immediately and rewarded. The psychological mechanism was understandable, even predictable. Acknowledging that earlier counts had been inflated would require admitting that resources had been allocated based on flawed intelligence, that tactical decisions had been made in response to threats that didn't exist, that pilots had died attacking phantom formations. Easier, psychologically safer, to accept the new higher count and adjust doctrine accordingly. By early 1945, a chasm had opened between Japanese perception and Pacific reality. In Tokyo war rooms, 35 American carriers prowled the ocean. In actual waters, 22 ships carried out operations that Japanese intelligence attributed to a force more than 50% larger. Decisions made in response to the imagined fleet would have consequences measured in thousands of lives. Admiral Kurita commanded the most powerful surface action group Japan had assembled in 2 years as he approached the Philippines in October 1944. His force centered on the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, supported by heavy cruisers whose main batteries could devastate any American carrier foolish enough to come within range. Intelligence briefings before departure had been explicit. American carrier strength in the region totaled 8 fleet carriers operating in 3 separate task groups. Kurita's mission was to draw out these carriers, destroy them if possible, but above all to avoid his force being destroyed before it could accomplish its primary objective of attacking the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf. As his ships entered the Sibuyan Sea, reconnaissance reports began arriving with increasing urgency. Carriers spotted to the north, additional carrier groups identified to the east, radio intercepts suggesting coordination between fleet elements totaling perhaps 10 or 11 carriers in the immediate operational area. The intelligence had been wrong, or perhaps American reinforcements had arrived faster than anticipated. Either way, Kurita faced a decision. His force could press forward into what appeared to be a trap, with carrier aircraft approaching from multiple vectors, or he could withdraw temporarily, preserve his strength, wait for the tactical situation to clarify. He chose preservation. His ships reversed course, withdrawing from the strait even as American commanders reading his movements couldn't understand what he was reacting to. The actual American carrier presence in threatening range of Kurita's force at that moment numbered exactly 4 carriers, and those 4 were already withdrawing northward in response to a separate Japanese naval group. The strait ahead of Kurita lay virtually undefended, the landing forces at Leyte Gulf exposed and vulnerable to exactly the kind of surface action his battleships had been designed to execute. The opportunity existed for perhaps 6 hours, a window during which Japan's most powerful remaining surface force could have achieved devastating results against an enemy caught in the vulnerable confusion of amphibious operations. But Kurita didn't see an opportunity. He saw the phantom carriers his intelligence had taught him to expect, lurking just over the horizon, waiting for him to commit before springing their trap. His decision was tactically sound based on the information he possessed. It was also based on information that was 40% hallucination. Within 3 weeks, American carrier aircraft would catch Kurita's force at anchor and destroy most of his ships in attacks against which his careful preservation offered no protection. The opportunity at Leyte Gulf, the narrow window when Japanese surface power might have mattered one final time, closed while Kurita waited for phantom carriers to reveal themselves. The mathematics of desperation were brutally simple, and they were calculated in rooms where phantom carrier counts shaped every conclusion. Japanese naval intelligence reported 35 American carriers. Japan possessed 4 operational carriers, having lost most of its pre-war fleet to attrition and battle damage. The ratio of nearly 9-to-1 made conventional engagement mathematically suicidal. A Japanese carrier task force attacking an American formation would be outnumbered, outgunned, overwhelmed by aircraft swarms their defenses couldn't hope to stop. Every strategic war game, every tactical simulation, every operational plan constructed from these numbers arrived at the same conclusion. Japan's carrier force couldn't win, couldn't even meaningfully slow the American advance through conventional naval aviation. The realization came slowly to commanders who had spent careers training for precisely the kind of carrier warfare they now couldn't contest. Something had to change. Some new approach had to be found. The weapon they couldn't match, the overwhelming carrier superiority they believed America possessed, had to be neutralized through means that didn't require Japan to build carriers it no longer had the resources or time to construct. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed organized suicide attacks in October 1944, the same month Japanese intelligence estimates reached their peak carrier count assessments. The proposal wasn't born from fanatic ideology alone, though that ideology would certainly fuel its implementation. It emerged from strategic calculation shaped by the Phantom Fleet. If America truly operated 35 carriers, and if each carrier represented an enormous investment of resources and industrial capacity, then trading 1 aircraft and 1 pilot for 1 carrier became strategically rational despite being morally catastrophic. The mathematics appeared to work. Japan still possessed aircraft. Japan still possessed pilots, though fewer with each passing week. What Japan lacked was time to train those pilots to the proficiency level required for conventional carrier engagement against overwhelmingly superior numbers. But crashing an aircraft into a carrier required less training than fighting one's way through its combat air patrol, evading its anti-aircraft fire, and executing a precision bombing run. The skill floor for suicide attacks was lower. The tactical effectiveness per sortie was potentially higher. And most importantly, the approach offered hope, or at least the appearance of hope, to commanders who had run out of conventional options when facing 35 carriers, that their training and experience said couldn't be defeated through traditional means. The first organized kamikaze units launched on the 25th of October 1944. Over the following 10 months, more than 3,800 pilots would die in these attacks, their aircraft transformed into guided missiles, their bodies into detonators. Some struck carriers, real ones, dealing genuine damage. Others missed, their sacrifices purchasing nothing but a splash in the Pacific and grief in distant homes. The tragedy was layered and complex. These pilots faced real carriers operated by real men, and their deaths and the deaths they caused were entirely concrete. But the strategic framework that had made their sacrifice appear necessary, the overwhelming carrier superiority that had convinced Japanese high command that conventional resistance was impossible, was 40% Phantom. Japan wasn't facing 35 carriers. It was facing 22, and even 22 was overwhelming. But the difference between overwhelming and impossible is the difference that determines whether desperation appears logical or insane. Against 22 carriers, conventional tactics might still accomplish something, might delay or damage or disrupt enough to matter. Against 35, only desperation remained. The Phantom carriers killed these pilots as surely as American anti-aircraft fire, because the Phantoms created the strategic impossibility that made suicide appear rational. The resource hemorrhaging was less dramatic than kamikaze attacks, but equally corrosive to Japan's shrinking military capacity. Fuel allocations were calculated based on estimated enemy fleet size and distributed to units tasked with tracking and engaging those forces. Submarines received fuel for extended patrols, searching for carrier groups intelligence insisted were operating in specific sectors. Aircraft flew reconnaissance missions over empty ocean hunting for Phantom task forces. Surface vessels deployed to intercept carrier movements that existed only in Tokyo assessment documents. Each sortie consumed fuel from reserves that couldn't be replenished. Each fruitless search burned petroleum that might have powered something useful. 3 Japanese submarines disappeared in December 1944 while conducting searches for reported carrier concentrations in sectors that intelligence had designated high priority. American destroyers sank 2 of them during their searches. The third simply vanished, presumably lost to operational accident or mechanical failure during extended deployment. The fuel they had consumed represented enough petroleum to keep a squadron of land-based fighters operational for 2 weeks of defensive patrols over a contested island base. The opportunity cost was measured in sorties not flown, defenses not mounted, attacks not conducted because the fuel had already been spent chasing Phantoms. Aircraft production priorities shifted toward carrier killer designs, toward torpedo bombers and dive bombers optimized for ship attack, rather than the land-based fighters that island defense desperately needed as American forces advanced closer to the home islands. The strategic logic was clear when based on Phantom carrier numbers. With 35 carriers threatening every Japanese position, anti-carrier capability became the top priority. Training pipelines accelerated kamikaze preparation at the expense of conventional pilot development, reasoning that creating adequate pilots for conventional engagement would take years Japan didn't have, while creating marginally adequate pilots for one-way missions could be accomplished in weeks. Intelligence assets including reconnaissance aircraft, submarines, and radio intercept stations focused on tracking the Phantom fleet, devoting analytical resources to confirming the location and movement of ships that would never be found because they had never been built. Every resource allocated toward Phantom carrier defense was a resource not available for defending against the actual 22 carriers that were systematically destroying Japan's Pacific Empire. The morale collapse was quieter than kamikaze crashes or submarine disappearances, but equally destructive to military effectiveness. Junior officers attended intelligence briefings, where they learned that America possessed 35 carriers with more reportedly under construction. They performed calculations in their heads, compared this number to Japan's 4 operational carriers, and the knowledge that Japanese shipyards weren't replacing losses at anything approaching American construction rates. The conclusions were unavoidable and devastating. Victory wasn't merely unlikely, it was mathematically impossible. They were fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity could absorb losses that would cripple Japan and then replace those losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The American fleet wasn't just larger, it was apparently infinite, a hydra whose heads multiplied faster than Japanese forces could cut them off. This fatalism spread through officer ranks and down into the enlisted sailors who heard the whispers, saw the despair in their commanders' eyes, and drew their own conclusions about a war whose outcome appeared predetermined. Lieutenant Commander Haruo Yoshino wrote in his diary in January 1945, 2 months before his death in a kamikaze attack, that the intelligence briefings had convinced him that Japan was fighting not another nation but a force of nature, something vast and impersonal and unstoppable as a typhoon. He didn't write about dying for emperor or empire. He wrote about the futility of resisting what couldn't be resisted, and the strange freedom that came from accepting this futility, the liberation of knowing that his death would accomplish nothing strategically, and therefore that it might as well accomplish something emotionally, might demonstrate a courage that statistics couldn't diminish. His despair was genuine, his courage was genuine. But the impossible industrial juggernaut he believed he was fighting was 40% mirage. He wasn't charging into a typhoon, he was charging into a storm, a dangerous and deadly storm certainly, but a storm of knowable dimensions that might be weathered or maneuvered around or survived through skill and determination. The difference between storm and typhoon is the difference between fighting and surrendering, between tactics and fatalism. The phantom carriers transformed rational fear into irrational despair, and despair kills military effectiveness more surely than any weapon. The discovery came in September 1945, when American intelligence officers occupied Japan and gained access to Imperial Navy archives that had survived the final bombings. They entered the rooms where strategic decisions had been made, examined the maps where phantom and real carriers had been tracked with equal conviction, and read the intelligence assessments that had guided Japan's desperate final year. The Allied officers expected to find evidence of sophisticated Japanese intelligence gathering, perhaps evidence that Japan had known more about American capabilities than the Allies had suspected. What they found instead provoked something close to disbelief. Document after document showed carrier count assessments that bore no relationship to reality. Intelligence summaries listed vessels by hull number and name, tracking their reported movements, assessing their capabilities, constructing detailed order of battle estimates for ships that had never existed. Some of these phantom carriers had been assigned construction histories, theoretical launch dates, speculation about their design specifications and air wing compositions. Japanese intelligence hadn't just miscounted existing vessels. They had willed into paper existence an entire phantom fleet, given it structure and detail and bureaucratic reality, and then shaped strategy around defending against this hallucination. The irony was almost too perfect, the kind of narrative symmetry that fiction would reject as too convenient. America's actual industrial capacity was already overwhelming. The real count of 22 carriers versus Japan's 4 represented an insurmountable advantage that would have dictated American victory regardless of whether Japan understood the true numbers. The United States didn't need phantom carriers to win. It was winning decisively with the real ones. But there is a profound difference between fighting 22 carriers and fighting 35 phantoms, a difference not of outcome but of psychology, not of what happens but of how those experiencing it understand what is happening to them. Against 22 carriers, a commander makes difficult decisions, accepts long odds, fights with the knowledge that defeat is likely but not certain, that skill and determination and luck might still matter. Against 35 phantom carriers, that commander makes impossible decisions, accepts no odds at all, fights with the certainty that defeat is inevitable, and that skill and determination and luck are merely choosing the manner of dying. The Phantom Fleet didn't change who won the war. It changed how Japan experienced losing it, transformed rational strategic difficulty into existential impossibility, and shaped decisions that would cost thousands of lives pursuing desperate solutions to problems that were terrifying, but not quite as terrifying as Japan believed. The Phantom carriers existed only in reconnaissance photographs misinterpreted, in intelligence reports double-counted, in psychological operations subtly encouraged, in confirmation bias that demanded seeing what was feared rather than what was real. They never displaced water, never launched aircraft, never threatened a single Japanese ship, yet they influenced strategy, shaped resource allocation, justified kamikaze doctrine, and broke morale as effectively as if they had been real. They demonstrated something that military historians would study for decades afterward, something that intelligence agencies would internalize as fundamental truth. In warfare, perception can be more dangerous than reality. An enemy who knows he faces overwhelming odds can still calculate probabilities, still identify opportunities within constraints, still fight rationally within the scope of what's possible. An enemy who believes he faces impossible odds stops calculating and starts despairing, stops identifying opportunities and starts preparing for inevitable defeat, stops fighting rationally and starts fighting desperately. Desperation makes mistakes that mere difficulty wouldn't produce. Fear of overwhelming force causes hesitation that actual overwhelming force might not justify. The Phantom carriers were made of misunderstanding and bureaucratic failure and psychological vulnerability, but they sank submarines as surely as depth charges, killed pilots as surely as anti-aircraft fire, and contributed to defeat as surely as any weapon forged in American shipyards. Japan lost the Pacific War to many factors, to industrial imbalance and strategic overextension and tactical errors that accumulated across 4 years of fighting. But among those factors, operating quietly in intelligence reports and strategic assessments, and the minds of commanders making decisions in windowless rooms, were 13 aircraft carriers that never existed anywhere except in the calculations that guided Japan's final desperate year. The defeat would have come regardless. The mathematics of the real 22 carriers ensured that. But the manner of the defeat, the specific choices that shaped those final months, the resource allocations and tactical decisions and doctrinal desperations, those were shaped significantly by ships that were never built, never launched, never steamed across any ocean, except the ocean of Japanese fear and miscalculation. Sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the one that can be photographed or counted or touched, but the one that exists in the terrible gap between what is real and what is believed to be real, in the space where perception becomes more powerful than truth, where phantom vessels materialize out of misunderstanding and sail through strategic planning documents, sinking real ships and killing real men through the simple fact of being believed in. And there were thousands more stories like this, waiting to be remembered.